if you looked in the mirror this morning, um, you probably just saw a reflection of your body fat. And maybe you judged it a little, or maybe you just thought of it as, stored energy, just passive insulation.
Right, just sitting there.
Yeah, exactly. But what you were actually looking at was a massive secret chemical command center that is actively negotiating with your brain right now.
It really is. I mean, it fundamentally changes how you view yourself when you realize that almost nothing in the human body is actually inert.
And today, whether you are cramming for a huge physiology exam or you are just insanely curious about the biological strings being pulled behind the scenes of your own mood and weight and energy, we are taking a deep dive into the endocrine system.
It's a huge topic.
It is. And the mission here is to decode the body's slow-burn chemical communication network. So we have a great stack of anatomy and physiology sources, and we're exploring what this system is, where the foundational concepts came from, and why the tidy, color-coded textbook definition you probably learned in high school biology is rapidly shifting under our feet.
Oh, it's shifting drastically. Yeah.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the specific messages the body is sending, we really need to understand the mechanics of how those messages travel, because it's completely different from the rapid-fire neural pathways we usually think about.
Yeah, to really grasp the endocrine system, you have to contrast it with the nervous system. I mean, the nervous system is built for speed and pinpoint precision.
Like a reflex.
Exactly. It operates in milliseconds, relying on electrical impulses traveling down very specific dedicated wires, our neurons. And they reach an exact localized target. If you touch a hot stove, a sensory signal zips up a specific nerve to your spinal cord and brain.
And then a motor signal zips right back down a different specific wire to your arm, telling your hand to pull away.
Right. It is incredibly fast, and it is physically wired.
Which makes the endocrine system, by comparison, like a broadcast network. It's operating on a vastly different timescale. We're talking seconds, minutes, days, or even decades.
Decades, yeah.
And instead of electrical impulses shooting down dedicated wires, it uses hormones. These are chemical messengers. And instead of targeting one specific cell with a physical connection, glands just dump these chemicals directly into the shared bloodstream. They just let the blood carry the message everywhere.
It's the physiological equivalent of a public radio broadcast. The message goes out into the ether, or in this case, the circulatory system, bathing nearly every single cell in the body.
Which is wild when you think about it.
It is. And the word endocrine actually captures this mechanism perfectly. It comes from the Greek word endon, meaning within, and krinein, meaning to separate or secrete. So an endocrine gland secretes its product inward directly into the blood.
As opposed to an exocrine gland.
Right, which is the anatomical opposite. Exocrine glands, like your sweat or salivary glands, secrete their products outward through physical ducts onto a surface.
Okay, so that classic definition, a dedicated gland secreting hormones inward, is really clean. But the sources show that this paradigm is undergoing a massive shift. The old school view was a tidy list of discrete glands. The pituitary, the thyroid, the pancreas, the adrenals.
Right, and if an organ wasn't on that list, it wasn't part of the system.
Exactly.
And for most of the 20th century, that was the absolute dogma. But over the last few decades, that rigidity has completely shattered. We now know that organs with primarily mechanical or filtration jobs are secretly acting as endocrine organs on the side.
The heart is a great example of this, actually. We think of it purely as a mechanical pump, but it actually secretes a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide.
ANT.
Yeah. If the heart muscle stretches too much because blood volume is too high, it releases this hormone to signal the kidneys to excrete sodium and water, which drops your blood pressure. The pump itself is sending chemical text messages to regulate the fluid lines.
And the kidneys do it too. I mean, their main job is filtering waste from the blood, but they also secrete a hormone called erythropoietin.
Which athletes sometimes abuse, right?
Yeah.
EPO.
Yes, EPO. It stimulates the bone marrow to produce more red blood cells when oxygen levels drop. And then, going back to what you said earlier, we have adipose tissue, or body fat.
The insulation.
Right. For a century, it was treated as passive energy blubber. But in 1994, researchers discovered that fat tissue secretes a hormone called leptin.
Leptin travels through the blood to your brain and signals satiety. It's how your fat stores literally tell your brain, hey, we have enough energy, you can stop eating.
Exactly. So adipose tissue is now universally classified by endocrinologists as a highly active, full-fledged endocrine organ.
It's a complete redefinition of anatomy.
Yeah.
And it's not just about long-distance communication anymore either, is it?
No, not at all. The traditional model is a hormone traveling far away through the blood. But the modern understanding includes paracrine signaling.
Paracrine meaning local.
Right, where a cell just releases chemicals to whisper to its immediate neighbors.
Hmm.
And there's also autocrine signaling, where a cell secretes a chemical message that binds to its own receptors.
So a cell leaving a molecular sticky note for itself.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. This shift reveals that the entire body is constantly talking to itself in a highly dynamic, decentralized way. But this broadcast method inherently introduces a massive logistical hurdle.
Yeah, if these chemical messengers are floating freely in the shared bloodstream, bathing every single tissue, why doesn't every organ react at once? I mean, if my pancreas dumps insulin into my blood to help store sugar, why doesn't my eyeball try to react to the insulin? How does the body avoid total physiological chaos?
That brings us to the crucial design feature of the system, which is the lock and key principle.
Oh,
Hormones are the keys, but they are completely biologically inert unless a cell possesses the specific molecular receptor, the lock, that perfectly fits that exact shape.
so the key needs the right lock to actually turn anything on.
Exactly. Insulin circulates everywhere, but only your muscle, liver, and fat cells actually possess the insulin receptors on their surfaces. To your eyeball, the insulin is effectively invisible because it has no locks for that key.
So this is like my analogy earlier.
Yeah.
The public radio broadcast is blasting everywhere, but you can only hear the music if you have a receiver physically tuned to that exact frequency.
Perfect.
It makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But looking back at how this chemical radio station was first discovered is genuinely surprising. You would assume the medical field of endocrinology started with something obvious, like the adrenaline response or the thyroid gland. But it was actually kicked off by digestion in the gut.
It was. And what's fascinating here is how it shattered the prevailing scientific view of the time. You have to look at the work of English physiologists William Bayliss and Ernest Starling in 1902.
Okay.
They were studying the gut, specifically looking at what happens when highly acidic, partially digested food, which is called chyme, leaves the stomach and enters the small intestine. They knew that the moment this acid hit the intestine, the pancreas would immediately release digestive fluids to neutralize the acid.
Which the body absolutely has to do, otherwise the stomach acid would just burn right through the intestinal lining.
Exactly. But the mystery was how the pancreas knew the acid had arrived. And at the turn of the century, the prevailing dogma was that the nervous system controlled absolutely all rapid physiological coordination.
They just assumed it was wired.
Right. They assumed a local nerve detected the acid in the gut, fired an electrical signal to the brain, and the brain fired a signal back down to the pancreas. So Bayliss and Starling dismantled that dogma. They took animal models and systematically severed every single nerve connecting the gut and the pancreas. They cut the physical wires.
Wow. And what happened?
When they introduced acid into the intestine, the pancreas still instantly secreted the digestive fluid.
Which means if it wasn't an electrical nerve impulse, they had to be a chemical traveling in the blood.
Yes. They scraped the mucosal lining of the intestine, extracted the chemical it was producing, and injected it directly into the bloodstream of a completely different animal. And the pancreas in that second animal immediately responded. They had discovered that the intestine itself was releasing a chemical messenger. They named this substance secretin. It was the very first hormone ever identified.
And then just 3 years later, in 1905, Starling coined the overarching term hormone. He pulled it from the Greek word hormao, meaning I excite or I arouse, which is, pretty dramatic origin for a digestive fluid, but it perfectly captures what these chemicals do. They wake up a target tissue.
Yeah.
But this raises a huge operational question. If an organ turns on a physiological process with a chemical message, how does it know when to turn the message off? Like, if the intestine excites the pancreas can't just pump out digestive fluid forever.
No, it would be disastrous. So to understand the shutoff mechanism, we have to look at the principle of homeostasis. In the mid-1800s, the French physiologist Claude Bernard proposed the concept of the milieu intérieur, the internal environment.
The idea that the body has to stay stable.
Right. He argued that the body actively regulates its internal chemistry to remain perfectly stable, regardless of external chaos. This concept was later formalized and named homeostasis in 1932 by Walter Cannon in his landmark book, The Wisdom of the Body.
That phrase, the wisdom of the body, implies a level of autonomous decision-making. And the mechanism behind that wisdom is the negative feedback loop. This is the organizing logic for almost everything in the endocrine system,
It
right?
really is.
Let's trace this using the HPT axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, which regulates your metabolism. It's a three-tiered chain of command.
Let's walk through it. It starts in the brain. Your hypothalamus detects that your basal metabolic rate is too low, so it responds by releasing TRH, which stands for thyrotropin-releasing hormone.
And it's worth pausing on that word, tropin or tropic.
Mhm.
In endocrinology, a tropic hormone is a hormone whose entire job is to target and stimulate another endocrine gland. It's like middle
Yep.
management.
That's a perfect way to view it. Middle management. TRH travels just a few millimeters down a tiny, localized blood portal to the pituitary gland, which sits right at the base of the brain. The pituitary receives the TRH and releases its own hormone, TSH, or thyroid-stimulating hormone.
Okay.
TSH then enters the general bloodstream, travels down to your neck, and binds to the receptors on your thyroid gland. The thyroid then releases the final effector hormones, T3 and T4, which enter the cells across your body and physically speed up your metabolism.
Okay, so the hypothalamus initiates the cascade, the pituitary amplifies it, and the thyroid executes it. But how does the hypothalamus know the job is done?
Through the negative feedback loop. As the thyroid pumps out T3 and T4, the levels of those hormones rise in your bloodstream. Eventually, that highly concentrated blood circulates back up to the brain.
Where it started.
Right. Both the hypothalamus and the pituitary possess receptors specifically for T3 and T4. When they detect that the levels are high enough, they automatically stop releasing TRH and TSH. The presence of the final product shuts off the factory that asked for it.
It functions identically to a smart home thermostat.
Yes.
If the house is freezing, which represents low T4, the thermostat, the pituitary, clicks the furnace on by sending out TSH. The furnace, the thyroid, pumps out the heat, the T4. Once the house reaches the target temperature, the ambient heat drifts back to the thermostat and the thermostat clicks off.
That's spot on. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this precise logic dictates how clinicians diagnose thyroid disorders today. Imagine you run a patient's blood work. Their T4 levels are incredibly low. The house is freezing. But their TSH levels are sky high.
Meaning the thermostat is desperately screaming at the furnace to turn on, sending massive amounts of the stimulating signal, but the furnace is broken and unable to produce heat.
Exactly.
That points directly to hypothyroidism, right? A failure at the level of the thyroid gland itself.
Yes. And conversely, if T4 is dangerously high, but TSH is undetectable, the furnace is stuck blasting heat, and the thermostat has completely shut down to try and compensate. That's hyperthyroidism.
So the clinical utility of understanding these loops is just immense.
Oh, it's the foundation of endocrine diagnostics.
Well, here's where it gets really interesting, though. We've just analyzed what happens when the furnace is broken. But a huge portion of the modern endocrine puzzle revolves around a totally different mechanical failure. What happens when the message is sent perfectly? The thermostat and the furnace are both working flawlessly, but the target cells just completely ignore the message.
You are touching on one of the most pervasive misconceptions in medicine. We tend to view endocrine disorders simply as too much hormone or too little hormone, a broken transmitter.
Right.
But very often, the primary pathology is receptor resistance. The receivers have essentially gone deaf.
And the most globally impactful example of this is insulin. To give some historical context from the sources, the specific clusters of cells in the pancreas that produce insulin were discovered way back in 1869 by a medical student named Paul Langerhans, which is why they are called the islets of Langerhans.
Such a great name.
Right. But nobody knew what they did. Inside those islets, you have beta cells, which secrete insulin to lower blood sugar by pushing it into tissues for storage. And you have alpha cells, which secrete glucagon to pull stored sugar out of the liver and raise blood sugar.
And it wasn't until 1921 that researchers Frederick Banting and Charles Best managed to isolate insulin, which fundamentally changed medicine. Before 1921, children who developed type 1 diabetes faced near certain death because their bodies just couldn't process energy.
Because in type 1 diabetes, the immune system mistakenly attacks and destroys the beta cells in the pancreas.
Yes. That is a true deficiency. The body produces zero insulin.
But type 2 diabetes, which makes up the vast majority of cases today, is fundamentally a disease of resistance, not deficiency.
Right.
In a patient developing type 2, the pancreas is often pumping out massive, elevated amounts of insulin. The signal is deafening. But because of complex metabolic factors, the muscle and liver cells downregulate their receptors. They just pull the locks off the doors, they stop listening.
Treating type 2, therefore, isn't simply about throwing more insulin into the system. It's about resensitizing the receivers. And this concept of receptor resistance leads us directly to one of the most fascinating and, frankly, expensive failures in pharmaceutical history.
Oh, the leptin failure.
Yes, involving leptin.
The $20 million Amgen heartbreak. Going back to 1994, Jeffrey Friedman's lab was trying to understand obesity, and they were studying a specific strain of genetically obese mice. This specific strain, described back in 1949, was known as the OBOB mouse.
Poor little guys.
Yeah. These mice had a genetic mutation where they lacked the leptin gene entirely. They had a true deficiency. Because they couldn't produce leptin, their brains never received the I'm full signal from their fat cells, so they ate voraciously and grew massive.
But when researchers injected these mice with synthetic leptin, replacing the missing hormone, the results were miraculous. The mice immediately stopped overeating and lost weight rapidly.
And this is where the money comes in.
Right. The pharmaceutical giant Amgen saw this data and paid roughly $20 million for the licensing rights. They believed they had found the Holy Grail, a direct chemical cure for human obesity. The theory was simple. Just give obese humans leptin, and the weight will melt away.
But the clinical trials in humans were an abject failure. And it comes back to that misconception about transmitters versus receivers. Amgen assumed obese humans were leptin deficient. But it turns out the vast majority of obese humans have plenty of leptin.
It's too much, even.
Yeah, in fact, because they carry more adipose tissue, their bodies are producing exponentially more leptin. The radio broadcast is blasting at maximum volume. Did the leptin miracle cure fail purely because science assumed humans had broken transmitters, when really we had deaf receivers?
Exactly. The underlying pathology wasn't a lack of leptin, it was leptin resistance. The receptors in the human brain had become numb to the signal. Pumping additional synthetic leptin into the bloodstream of someone who is leptin resistant is like shouting into the ear of someone wearing heavy noise-canceling headphones.
It doesn't change the outcome.
Not at all. It proved that a mouse with a rare genetic deficiency is not a functional mirror for a human suffering from complex, lifestyle-induced receptor resistance.
But the field did learn from that failure. The breakthrough weight loss drugs of the 2020s, the GLP-1 agonists like semaglutide, they abandoned the leptin pathway entirely.
They did, yeah.
Instead, they mimic a totally different hormone, glucagon-like peptide 1, which is secreted by the gut. It targets different receptors to signal satiety in the brain and physically slow down gastric emptying. They basically found a different key for a totally different lock that hadn't been down-regulated yet.
It's brilliant. And the complexity of these interacting systems, fat acting as a gland, the gut regulating the brain, it highlights how the endocrine system manages our daily interaction with our environment. Which brings us to the ultimate environmental challenge.
Right. And how the body processes stress is governed by the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. People constantly lump adrenaline and cortisol together as generic stress hormones, but structurally and temporally, they're operating in completely different playing fields.
Entirely different playing fields. Adrenaline, or epinephrine, is the immediate fast-acting response. It is produced in the inner core of the adrenal gland called medulla, which is directly wired to the sympathetic nervous system.
So that's back to the wires.
Exactly. It acts in seconds. It's the jolt that makes your heart race when a car swerves into your lane. Cortisol, on the other hand, is the endocrine response. It is produced in the outer layer of the gland, the adrenal cortex, and it operates over minutes, hours, and even days.
And the mechanism behind the cortisol cascade bridges the nervous and endocrine systems beautifully. Let's say you see a threat. Your visual cortex processes it, your amygdala interprets the fear, and it sends an electrical neural signal to the hypothalamus.
The translator.
Right, the hypothalamus acts as a translator. It converts that rapid electrical signal into a chemical one, releasing CRH, or corticotropin-releasing hormone.
That CRH travels to the pituitary, which releases ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. ACTH then travels through the general circulation down to the adrenal cortex, triggering the release of cortisol.
And cortisol's primary job is to mobilize sustained energy. It raises your blood glucose so your muscles have fuel to keep running from the predator. But critically, to afford that energy, cortisol aggressively suppresses non-essential functions.
It has to prioritize.
Exactly. If you're fleeing a tiger, your body decides that digesting your lunch, repairing cellular damage, and fighting off a mild cold are not immediate priorities. It shuts down the immune and digestive systems to route all power to survival.
Which is an evolutionary masterpiece for surviving acute, life-threatening danger. But it is disastrous for navigating modern life.
Because the tigers are gone.
Right. Our biology evolved to handle a saber-toothed tiger attack, followed by intense physical exertion, followed by rest. We are not adapted for constant, low-grade psychological stress like chronic financial anxiety or a toxic work environment. Chronic activation of the HPA axis means the body is perpetually flooded with cortisol.
And the literature clearly links this chronic exposure to severe downstream effects. It causes impaired memory consolidation in the hippocampus. It keeps the immune system continually suppressed, making you susceptible to illness. And it drives elevated cardiovascular risk due to constant metabolic strain.
Moreover, the modern environment introduces chemical stressors that our ancestors never faced, specifically endocrine-disrupting chemicals, or EDCs.
Oh, like plastics.
Right. These are synthetic compounds found in everyday items, like bisphenol A, BPA in certain plastics or phthalates in cosmetics. Because the molecular structures closely resemble our natural hormones, they can inadvertently fit into our cellular locks.
They mimic the keys.
Exactly. They can act as mimics, artificially turning processes on, or as blockers, jamming the lock so the real hormone can't bind.
Now, to be clear from the sources, the debate in the scientific community isn't whether these EDCs bind to receptors in a petri dish or at high doses in animal models. They absolutely do. No one is arguing that. The fierce, ongoing regulatory debate is about the real-world clinical impact at the extremely low, chronic levels of environmental exposure that humans actually experience daily.
And this raises an important question about the boundaries of the system itself. We've talked about the brain acting as an endocrine gland through the hypothalamus. We've talked about cortisol directly regulating the immune system. We also know that immune cells themselves can synthesize and secrete hormones.
It's all blurring
The
together.
traditional lines are completely dissolving.
So if the brain is acting like a gland and immune cells are acting like glands, is it even scientifically accurate to call the endocrine system a standalone anatomical entity anymore?
At the highest levels of research, no, not really. Since the field of psychoneuroimmunology began expanding, scientists increasingly view the body not as isolated systems, but as a singular, massively integrated neuroendocrine immune network.
That's a mouthful.
It is. But the nervous, endocrine, and immune systems are essentially just different dialects of the same biological language. Separating them into different textbook chapters is a useful pedagogical tool for teaching first-year biology students, but biologically, the boundary does not exist.
It's like realizing that the plumbing, the electrical wiring, and the Wi-Fi in a smart home aren't three completely separate utilities. They're all integrated, constantly reading and reacting to each other to keep the house running.
Exactly. You cannot influence one pathway without sending ripples through the others.
So looking back at our mission for this deep dive, it is clear the endocrine system is so much more than a static list of glands to memorize. It is a dynamic, full-body broadcast network. It governs your circadian rhythm and sleep cycle, with the pineal gland releasing melatonin in response to fading light.
It actively negotiates your appetite through the leptin released by your body fat.
Right. It dictates your basal metabolism via your thyroid, and it mobilizes your defenses against modern stress. It is the silent, pervasive chemical internet that fundamentally runs your life.
And exploring this leaves us with a rather profound philosophical implication.
Okay.
We have historically viewed human consciousness, emotion, and control as centralized phenomena. We think the mind lives entirely inside the brain, sitting in the skull, pulling levers like an operator in a control room.
Sure.
But if our fat cells are actively negotiating our drive to eat, and our gut is sending chemical text messages to regulate our energy, and our immune system is in direct, constant conversation with our stress levels, maybe the centralized control room is an illusion. Maybe our mind isn't just in our heads. Biologically speaking, it seems our consciousness and behavioral drives are actually distributed throughout our entire bloodstream.
Next time you see a rigid, color-coded mechanical diagram of human anatomy, remember, the reality inside you is infinitely more chaotic, beautifully intertwined, and constantly communicating. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.